is there a constitutional or a legal basis for multiculturalism? Now, you've got to understand, multiculturalism is an ideology, and like every ideology, it makes a claim to absolute truth. The new gospel, that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, and we're all going to live happily ever after. Well, I don't believe there is a constitutional basis for multiculturalism in the Australian Constitution. The Australian Constitution does not permit the establishing of a state religion by the Commonwealth, and I'm not suggesting for a moment that there's any attempt by multiculturalism to establish a religion. But successive governments are being disproportionately influenced by multicultural lobbies that have an Islamic agenda. And an instance of this is the pernicious spread of halal food, and the tax that's being placed on halal food is testimony to this. This is a religious charge levied on consumers. It is not a tax levied by a government, but it infringes on our secular rights not to have a religious charge levied on products that we buy. It is a scam, and it is Islam getting its toe in the door towards a state religion. The legislative power of the Parliament seems to be covered by 51 of the Constitution, which states the Parliament shall, subject to this Constitution, have power to make laws for the peace, order and good governance of the Commonwealth with respect to, and its subsection 27, immigration and emigration, and subsection 28, the influx of criminals. The first responsibility of government is to protect its citizens. That means not engaging in social engineering policies that put its citizens' rights at risk. As Donald Trump said, they, politicians, are letting political correctness put your lives at risk. Donald Trump mightn't be right about many things, but he was right about that. So there is no constitutional basis for multiculturalism. It is done by stealth. No political party, as I said earlier, ever went to a federal election with a platform to introduce social engineering called multiculturalism. It just crept in. Multiculturalism has emerged. It's a giant paper tiger. And its means of achieving its goals is political correctness. Liberal and Labor took a bipartisan approach to non-discriminatory immigration, allowing people from every country professing every culture and faith to immigrate here. The Greens, of course, take an even more radical bipartisan approach. They would open the floodgates to the boats. Refugee Action Group wants to decriminalise people smuggling. Now, it's time for people, for the electorate, to become aware of these issues and to make their vote count. We had, leading up to the last election, the Prime Minister conducted a gathering at Kirribilli House, and the main people he invited were members of the Muslim community, including a Muslim radical cleric. Now, I don't think that went over well with the electorate, and I think that the result of the election was influenced by many things, but people are concerned, and you can see this in the growing vote that Pauline Hanson received at the last election. She's raising issues that for too long we've been unable to speak about. We've got the situation now where we've got the widow of Mohammed Sharif. He's another one who went overseas, and children holding up severed heads. They now want to come back to Australia. They've been off, they've had their jihadi holiday, things have, the holidays gone bad, and they want to come back. The first place they're going to go to will be settling. Do you think it's fair that we will be keeping them and their families, or him and his family? How much did Mohammed Elamar work? How much tax did he pay over the years? The fellow who was down in Lint Cafe, Man Monas, look at the trouble he's caused. How much work did he ever do in this country? How much constructive work? How much tax did he pay to justify the disproportionate amount of trouble he caused? None. Islam is a narcissistic belief system. They don't care what it costs, how wasteful. The basic tenor is Islam will triumph over the whole world. So any means to bring down the political system that hosts them is permissible. This is going to become the burning issue for the future of the West. I'm out of time. I'm probably over time. I thank you all for coming. Carry on the good fight. They never get warmed up.
Never enough time. Never enough time.
Oh, so many men, so little time.
That's right. The problem is too big for us all, as they say. Our final speaker is Dr. Jim Salem. Many would be aware he's the leader of Australia First political party. Been around in political circles for probably more years than he'd care to admit. And Jim will be speaking on no more Australian involvement in New World Order wars. So please welcome Dr. Jim Salem.
The system that we euphemistically call the New World Order didn't come from nowhere. It took, if you like, a very long time to mature. You could say that it's the continuation and the intensification of a system that came to dominate the Western world after 1945, after the military defeat of the fascisms. When we talk about New World Order wars, we should be aware that the system that came to power in the Western world after 1945 has been continually at war, and I don't think there's ever been a year when there hasn't been a war. And we've seen in the USA, in particular, the emergence during the Second World War and after it of an enormous military-industrial complex that represented, if you like, one part of America's moneyed elites. The other parts include the banking communities, big oil and so forth. You might say that the United States, as the leading power after 1945, was almost a condominium of interests, a shareholding system, and the politics was the facade for that system. The system went to war because a system like this always needs an enemy. It chose one. It chose an enemy called communism. None of that meant that communism was good. In fact, communism was bad. But the system has the remarkable ability to find enemies and go and beat up on them. And it's in the justification of the beating up on an enemy that they get a lot of people to go into these wars and to follow them, believing that somehow or other their wars are moral and correct and they always have some point at issue. But in the late 1980s, in 1989 through to 1991, something very fundamentally in world politics changed. You had the collapse of the Soviet Union. And with the collapse of the Soviet Union, you had the collapse of the bogeyman called communism. But the New World Order wars that we see had their gestation during that time, as I said, and one very particular item always comes to mind. It's a remarkable video. You can find it if you trawl around on the internet. It only lasts for about 90 seconds, and it's an incredible video of Margaret Thatcher in a room in Pakistan. And in this room in Pakistan, there's everyone with a rag on his head that you can possibly imagine, and an AK-47 and a rocket launcher in his hand. And Margaret Thatcher says in that marvellous voice that she's surrounded by the forces of civilisation and that they're going to take up arms against the Soviet Union. Well, I'd favour the Soviet Union because I do not believe that the people in that room represented any force of civilisation at all. In fact, quite the contrary. And that some of those forces that are in that room included people such as Osama bin Laden, whose name is well known. The creatures in that room were funded, armed, aided and abetted by the intelligence agencies of the Western world. And there's a marvellous book on it called Blowback. You can go and get it. And it's based on a lot of the declassified documents of the CIA and some documents from MI6 and MI5. So the New World Order wars that we'll talk about have their birth in that war in Afghanistan. In Afghanistan, as I said, the USA's intelligence service and the others set out to arm an Islamic insurgency, very successfully I would add, to oppose the invasion or the occupation of Afghanistan by the USSR and its satellite troops led by President Najibullah, a war that went on until 1990 when Najibullah was killed. Those forces then gestated in Afghanistan and become the world terrorist movement against which the New World Order then says that it's at war. In other words, it created them and then it says that it's at war with them. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, we see, as I said, the intensification of what had in fact gone before. The New World Order that President Bush I enunciated set out to break up all of the certainties that we knew as states. It interfered in Europe, where it attempted to break up Yugoslavia. It interfered in the post-Soviet Union, where it attempted to break up the Caucasus. It attempted to break up the mini-states of the Caucasus. It was quite happy that some European states are divorced, and quite rightly maybe they should have been divorced. Perhaps Serbia and Croatia should have been divorced, perhaps the Czech Republic and Slovakia should have been divorced, etc., etc. But that's not the New World Order's aim. In breaking up larger states, it has smaller states, and smaller states are open to the coercion of an international power. Into the gap comes this plethora of organisations like the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, in some parts of the world, the NAFTA in America, and later on in our own century, the CHAFTA. We see the European Union imposing its will everywhere throughout Europe and so forth. But it didn't only intervene in Europe, it intervened everywhere. In Africa, states were torn apart. In Asia, wars were incited. But the Middle East always seemed to be one of the main foci, if you like, of the New World Order. But it found that it also had rivals. As I said, they then decided to go to war against the very thing that they had created, namely Islamist terrorism. That's a good one, because the New World Order had, as its first enemy, it proclaimed, or rather the earlier system, proclaimed itself at war with fascism. It said that fascism was going to take over the world and do this and that, so it decided to gang up on the dictators and overthrow them. And a lot of people agreed with that. It seemed like a good idea at the time. It then said that communism was its enemy. So it would then go and beat up on the communists and overthrow them and create the market millennium. But then it had a new enemy called Islamist terrorism, so then it would find them everywhere in the world, having created them, and it would then lead us to the market millennium. Okay. The New World Order wars have also been characterised by state terrorism. And let's be quite frank, if you fund groups like Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, then you are in fact a state terrorist. You are funding a terrorist movement. You know you're doing it. Therefore, you are in fact a state terrorist. But that's not the only movement that they favoured. From time to time, there is evidence that some of these Islamist movements in Africa have certainly been funded. In Somalia, when it became a failed state, there were some groups that were funded. In the Sudan, there's evidence that one of the groups there was funded, which quite ironically had been harbouring Carlos the Jackal at one point of its existence. It has intervened in the Arabian Peninsula and funded groups, and it always had full knowledge that the Wahhabis of Saudi Arabia gave money and resources to Osama bin Laden. So its own ally, the Saudi Arabian government, the United States government, was well aware, was also funding him for purposes of its own. The terror that they've waged has been pretty absolute. We've lived, in a way, for 25 years with endless references to terror. We live in this age of terror. And that's very good for business too, because it's good for intelligence agencies, it's good for the idea of a security state, it's good for an idea for rules and regulations to take away your freedoms, because you are at war with terror, albeit the terror that they have created in the first instance. That's not mentioned in the dialogue. I mean, did you ever see President Bush, Mark 1 or 2, get up and make a mea culpa and say, look guys, we're very sorry, we actually funded these maniacs, now we're actually going to go and get them, and we pledge to you that we're never going to fund any maniacs like this again. It was a mistake. No, that certainly never occurred. In fact, although the information was out there, and it was certainly public information, and never denied, it was the old saying, where do you hide a tree? Well, you hide the tree in the forest. So the tree was simply lost. The tree of truth was simply lost in the war on terror. Another enemy became very clear in the 1990s of the New World Order system was Russia. Russia was looted systematically by a group of oligarchs who seized power there under the reign of Boris Yeltsin. That was all supported and so on by the USA. The USA extended the borders of NATO contrary to the pledge made in 1991 right up to the border of the Soviet Union, or the border of the Russian Federation. The CIA funded the Chechen Muslims, who waged a war from about 1996 through to about 2002-3, when Putin crushed it finally and irrevocably. They funded Islamic extremism in Chechnya. Why did they do this? They wanted to wage a type of terror against Russia. They wanted to coerce the Russian Federation. So the CIA and other agencies funded these lunatics who murdered children. You remember some of the incidents. They took over a movie theatre. Hundreds of people were killed and maimed in what they did. That was all supported by our ally. That was all done. So, having not learned the lesson of Osama bin Laden and so on, they continued to fund and support these sorts of movements. In the end, thankfully, Russia prevailed and the Chechen movement was crushed. But a lot of these Chechen extremists turned up again in Syria. So the New World Order had a lot, if you like, on its plate. Now, Australia has always been part of that system. No Australian politician has ever questioned it. Not even in our parliament have the issues like this ever been spoken about or raised. The Greenies even have virtually said nothing about it, and they're supposed to be the anti-American party par excellence, and they've never hardly said a word. Even rebellious politicians, my old friend Graham Campbell never mentioned it. Pauline Hanson's never mentioned it. Some of the other mavericks have never mentioned it either. Australia seems to always follow on. If you go back into the earlier system, if you go back to, say, 1939, you'd remember the declaration that the then Prime Minister made as a result of the Germans not evacuating Poland this morning and the British ultimatum and blah, blah, blah. Britain is at war with Germany. Therefore, or rather the words were, as a consequence, Australia is also at war, as a consequence. Australia did not conduct an independent foreign policy. I often make the point that in 1939 Australia had never signed the Statute of Westminster, the British instrument that actually gave you the right to conduct your own independent foreign policy. In 1939, to their enormous credit, and I praise them for it, the Irish Free State declared neutrality. And the Irish Free State could do that because it had signed the Statute of Westminster that Australia had not. When Australia went to war against Japan, Australia made an illegal declaration of war against Japan. Prime Minister Curtin declared war on them, which he did not in fact have the power to do. But Australia's entire history has always been one of dependence and following on from others. The New World Order wars seem to have an inordinate, if you like, interest in the Middle East. In fact, you might say that for reasons, there could indeed be some script written into the New World Order script that focuses them on the Middle East. As I said, the USA was instrumental in the arming and the creation of Al-Qaeda, and Al-Qaeda turned around and bit them on the rear end. By the late 1990s, Al-Qaeda was attacking US targets all over the Middle East. Ships in Yemen, American ambassadors and things in Uganda, they were running riot, but still no one was talking about the fact that the USA had created them. In 2001, we had the Twin Towers matter, which has been widely debated in many ways. It's now a legal thing in the USA. If you want to sue the Saudi Arabian government for what happened on the 9th of September, the 11th of September, well, you can, because the Saudi Arabian government was involved in the funding of bin Laden's networks. Very strange thing. They were also involved, not only in that, but they were involved in the 1991 invasion of Iraq. One disaster. They went on then to adopt aspects of Israel's so-called Yinon plan, named after a particular Israeli exposed to the world many years later by a crusading Israeli historian called Israel Shahak, a perverted and twisted plan to see the Middle East itself divided up into miniature states that would be forever at war with each other, and Sunni and Shiite Islam at each other's throats to the point where the Middle East would be set on fire. You could adopt the view by saying that the Yinon plan is indeed exactly what's being carried out, although the Israeli government denies that it's got any basis at all. Shahak disagreed, and so did many other brave Israelis who brought that particular instrument to public view. Israel also has waged several wars in the Middle East, sometimes against unsavoury folk, but most assuredly for its own foreign policy dimensions, such as the invasion of Lebanon in 2006, where despite inflicting massive casualties on Hezbollah, the Israeli army was for the first time militarily defeated. There is a limit to the power reach. But usually it's not Israel who engages in the wars. It's the coalitions of the willing who carry out the wars. Israel keeps in the background so as not to inflame Arab street opinion, although Israel benefits from the wars. We saw in 2011 the New World Order extend itself with the so-called Arab Spring, a load of waffle if ever there was. Suddenly masses come onto the streets and protest against dictators, and the government of Tunisia falls, and mobs come in Egypt and the government of Egypt falls. There's a civil war in Libya that NATO supports by military action that leads to the overthrow of Colonel Gaddafi. I take the argument that the current President of the United States takes, that the overthrow of Gaddafi was a bloody disaster. Gaddafi warned the European world in no uncertain terms. He even begged the head psychopath Tony Blair, don't overthrow me, you know what's coming. There'll be armies of refugees across the Mediterranean. I'm turning back their boats. I'm sending them back to Chad. I'm detaining them. If you overthrow me, I'll be replaced by a radical Islamic government which will open up the Mediterranean to refugee assault. Well, they murdered Colonel Gaddafi. He was, what was it Hillary Clinton did? We came, we saw, and he died, she said. The true mark of a degenerate psychopath is what she said. She enjoyed it. In fact, when they murdered Colonel Gaddafi, who was anally shot, you could imagine, but she thought it was good fun. That's the Secretary of State of the United States. But that's exactly what happened. There was no benefit to the Western world in overthrowing Gaddafi. Was he a clownish figure? Yes, in some ways he was. Was he a dictator? In some ways he was. But there was no Islamic militancy in Libya, fact. So we got rid of him. The circus then moved on to Syria, and the New World Order attempted to overthrow Bashar al-Assad. Now, we had a forum here in Sydney last December about that. You can have a look at the YouTube about it. Many speakers came. You've had Tim Anderson speaking here about it. The attempt to overthrow Assad was also mischievously misplaced. And in fact, right now, there's even an argument between the British government and President Trump over whether or not the attempt to overthrow Assad should continue. And be very careful here. Brexit or no Brexit, the ruling class is still in power in England. Of course they are. They didn't go. Where did they go? They're still there. Boris Johnson says, the foreign secretary as they're called, he wants the Assad government removed. The United States says that's no priority for us and Assad can stay. The French, Hollande, the so-called socialist president of France, he's quite happy also for Assad to be overthrown. Once again, what happened from the whole thing? The fragmentation of a country, massive hordes of refugees. These New World Order folk, they know exactly what they're doing. And one of the classic, if you like, jokes of it was a journalist who was, I think, in Egypt. And he was watching one of these demonstrations that brought down the Egyptian president in 2012, I think that was now, or late 11, early 12. And one of the men he saw organising the demonstration was exactly one of the same men he'd seen in Serbia trying to bring down the president of Serbia. Same men. Well, why would he be there? And yet, there he is. George Soros, as they say, has long reach. We've seen the New World Order in a couple of ways get its wings cut. One of the interesting things that occurred last year was the election of President Trump in the United States. So there is, if you like, a certain challenge to what's actually occurring in the United States. However, anyone who followed the long saga of the inauguration of the president and the confirmation of the secretary of this and the secretary of that would have noticed a pattern. Although there are many new people who are the front people in the American government, many of the people are the same people who were there before. Nothing's changed. They're the same people who were there before. And the argument has come that what you actually have is some sort of gut feeling that's come up from the bottom that the way that the United States has been run and the wars it has been asked to fight are not right, are very wrong, it must change. But there's an old story from the Marxists, which is well worth quoting, is they used to use these terms, quote, the working class simply cannot take control of the current state machinery and use it for its own purposes, finish. If you use that very, very clever quote and change it to simply an expression of common sense, it is that a great movement coming up from the bottom of the people cannot take control of the current state machinery and wield it for its own purposes, finish. That's actually what's happening right now in the United States. Someone pointed out to me a delicious quote from the former president, the great President Abraham Lincoln, and it's well worth thinking about. There are many rights and wrongs in the American Civil War or the War for Southern Independence, if there are people who think that way. But people would know that the Confederate Army opened fire on an American fort and therefore brought on the war. And the following day, Abraham Lincoln issued one of the most remarkable documents in American history. It's a proclamation. And it says, whereas combinations too powerful to be suppressed by the normal workings of the judiciary and the legal services have usurped authority, and he lists a number of states. And then he calls out the national militia, almost like a posse, to go and arrest Jefferson Davis. Okay. You could almost argue that what's occurring in the United States today leads to the point where perhaps some president might issue a proclamation saying, whereas combinations too powerful to be removed by the normal workings of the electoral, judicial and other institutions of the United States have usurped control of the Republic, I in my office am but a parallel government to the real power, and I therefore call out the American Armed Forces and through the governors of the states, the National Guard, to reinforce Republican government in the United States. There's a word for that. It's called civil war. What's actually occurred in America in the debates on New World Order policy is there's a rising number of people in America who recognise that something's gone very, very wrong with US foreign policy. They don't understand where it came from. They're very ordinary folk and so on, but they can see that it's there. And of course, it is there. In fact, it's a proverbial elephant in the room. The contradictions between an elected president and a system that's entirely in the hands of what we might call the insider government in the United States shows in the contradictory things that President Trump will say. I'll give you an example. Last week he said, as I mentioned before, that the removal of Assad from control in Syria is something that the US doesn't contemplate and doesn't want to do. His Secretary of State said, however, that the government in Iran was a really bad thing, and going back through other statements, there's a hint that they might want to overthrow it. Can you imagine the war if you tried to overthrow the government of Iran. You'd have a war far and, well, it would become a global conflagration. There is no doubt about that. Iran has, for trade reasons, two very powerful allies. One is Russia for trade, and the other is China for trade. So if you want to overthrow the government in Tehran, good luck, because you actually invite world war. Also too, President Trump says that he'd like to have a better relationship with the Russian President, Vladimir Putin. I agree with that. I think that's a marvellous idea. But what do we find? We find many people in the US administration talking about the Russian bullying of Ukraine and the rights of Ukraine and the idea that the US should commit itself to Ukraine. Now, Ukraine's got the right to be a country, most assuredly, but the government that rules in Kiev does not represent Ukrainians. It represents the same sort of people who George Soros imposed originally on the government in Ukraine about 7 or 8 years ago. It's the same sort of thing. Joe Biden goes there, the former US vice president, says what marvellous people the government of Ukraine are. Well, if Joe Biden says that, I'd suspect that the government of Ukraine are rats. But that's another story. The New World Order and the sort of obstacles it faces are very, very substantial. We are seeing right now the division of the world and the redivision of the world. If you look at things in a big picture and not in a small picture, Lenin, the communist theorist, said that as long as you had a system of money and imperialism, you'd get endless attempts to divide and redivide the world. One of Lenin's great rivals, a fellow called Karl Kautsky, a name almost forgotten now. No one ever mentions him, all the Reds and all that. Karl Kautsky disappeared off the radar. But he did say something that was very, very clever during the First World War. He predicted that the great banks and the great corporations of the world who were ruling the Western world might actually realise one day that warfare between them might be a bad thing. And they'd create a system that he called inter-imperialism. A system where all the imperialists would get together and run it all together for themselves, and the French, the Germans, the British and all the rest would no longer fight. In a way, he predicted what the New World Order is. It's a system of inter-imperialism. The biggest crooks on earth have all, if you like, banded together, not to fight each other, but to extend the boundaries of the free market reality. And of course, I'll throw you a bit of democracy as well. All things are systems. Communism is a beautiful theory, but you can't separate it from a bullet in the back of the head in the Lubyanka. Democracy is a beautiful theory too, but you cannot separate it from the fact that it's the rule of people with money. That's what it is. Doesn't matter what the words are, it's what it is. That's what democracy is. So the New World Order says that it wants to extend the bounds of democracy. It really means it wants to extend the boundaries of those who run the world with money. One of its obstacles, of course, that the New World has is the rise of China. That's a serious problem. And indeed, you might say, if you were a fatalist, that the two systems, the one that rules the Western world and the one that rules China, are slowly but inevitably moving towards war. They clash all over the world. They clash from one belt, one road systems of trade through to the value of Chinese money on the International Stock Exchange. They clash everywhere. The other great clash the New World Order has is the still unresolved issue of what to do with Islamist terrorism. Now let's come back to the start. Who created this? You've had speakers here say to you at different points of time that ISIS, and Trump said it during the presidential election campaign last year, that ISIS was created by Hillary Clinton. It's a quip, but it's true. ISIS was created by those forces in the West that funded it, aided it, abetted it, and allowed it to do things to achieve objectives. One of those objectives was to bring down the regime of President Assad. And it's still going on in one way or another. Turkey was behind it. Qatar, the Wahhabist dictators of Saudi Arabia were involved in it. They're all funding this global terrorist movement. And yet, you know, we folk in mushroom land, we're supposed to accept that our politicians now are oh so serious about wanting to deal with these terrorists. I think in some ways the New World Order system's got itself involved in a fight that it doesn't exactly know how to get out of, for the very reason it created the Frankenstein in the first place. It's gone from bad to worse. It created Al-Qaeda, and then it creates the bastard son of Al-Qaeda, and now they're even saying that if they exterminate ISIS, there's supposed to be some other group waiting in the wings that's even worse. So you can imagine where this is in fact actually leading. So the New World Order's got itself involved in a war that it can't quite win. Now, there are various solutions to it. We could debate them, including getting out of the Middle East, but that's something, for another day. The third interesting challenge that the New World Order has is a challenge from within. And we talked about that a moment ago, where we talked about the election in the United States and what is in fact a challenge from within by a lot of Americans who've questioned where that superpower has in fact ended up. That's very important. The other great challenge that they're facing every day now is the breakup of the European Union project. You might say that after 1945, power was America-Europe. They ruled Europe by force and by terror, and let's make no mistake, the United States also ruled Europe by terror. They executed, they murdered, they set up paramilitary gangs called anti-communists, they smashed anything that they didn't agree with or like. The system's now collapsed. The East European system's collapsed. But now we're seeing the birth of another system, Russia-Europe. And we see that in many ways too. The popularity of Putin in the West, the links between Marine Le Pen, who may freakishly win the French presidency next month or the month after. We're seeing the heavy involvement of Russians in European politics. In fact, so much to the point where, as we know, Trump was even accused of winning the US presidency with Putin's help. But whichever way it goes, we're seeing parts of Europe question the relationship, the transatlantic relationship, and they're actually looking eastwards, not westwards. This could mean, in some ways, the breakup of the European Union. If the European Union breaks up, then the system America-Europe is gone and it will inevitably be replaced by Russia-Europe. I'm not talking of the domination of Europe by Russia, but simply a system that unites the former East with the former West. There are schools of opinion in Europe that suggest that this may be a reality. I won't go into it now other than to say that they belong to various schools of opinion called Eurasianism and geopolitics. Eurasia not meaning the sad marriage of Australians with Chinese or something, but they mean it in the sense of the continental power, Europe-Asia, the power of Eurasia. As you know, it would be one of the greatest economic powerhouses on earth to in fact unite Russia and Europe into a single, well I won't say single, I'll use that phrase loosely, a federated marketplace and a system for the exchange and the preservation of European culture take on a whole new force. And these forces are slowly growing, I think, inside European politics. A lot of people find them now very, very agreeable things. Is the New World Order system in a lot of trouble? Well, yes, it is. It's in trouble because the economic basis of it is beginning to fall apart. The collapse of the European Union, the fall of the US dollar, various problems inside that system of hyperinflation that comes out of America suggest that the New World Order, which relies on the American superpower, make no mistake about that, it does. Without the US superpower, there can be no world order system. If the US superpower is brought down either by its economic folly or challenged by decent Yanks who say enough's enough, that's the end of the system we know as the US superpower, and with that the New World Order system to a considerable extent perishes. It has internal immigration problems that we live with, unfortunate ones, that are ripping the society apart, making it not only ungovernable for us, or rather unpalatable for us, as Frenchmen, as Germans, as Italians, as Swedes and whatever, but at the same time making it impossible for those who run those countries to actually be able to run them. The United States, as Trump said, has lost control of its borders. Well, it has. It makes the system unworkable and unviable. And most of all, there is this slow awakening of tens of thousands of mainly young people throughout the United States and Europe to the fact that there is this system, that it's not a conspiracy and it's actually real and it should be abolished. So where do we end up? We end up in the fact that Australia, which has been part and parcel of the system must also have its challenge to the idea of New World Order politics. I think that because of Australia's past, it will be even harder here than it will be for, say, Germans or Frenchmen, or even for Americans who'll stagger around in the dark wondering how the bloody hell it ever happened to them. But for us, it's even more onerous because Australians are lapdogs and servants. Instead of declaring that we didn't want to fight in 1914, or in fact I often joke to people that the Australian military of the First World War has two great achievements. One we love, Anzac, and the other one the mutiny on the Western Front, because we realised how moronic it was. But Australia doesn't often have its moments like that. We didn't declare neutrality in 1939. We followed every war that the system's ever given us. We went through Vietnam, we went through Malaya, we went through everything that's ever been given to us and done it as if it's our duty to, as if you get something out of it. We went to Afghanistan, what did we get? We went to Iraq, what did we get? We didn't get anything. In fact, if anything, all we've done has been dragged into this massive cesspool, which is the Middle East, that is a quagmire and needs to sort out its own problems without our help. That's the truth. I think that it is being questioned. In fact, I'm certain it is. And although last year the pundits talked very heavily of Brexit and the election of Trump as being signifiers of change, and there's some truth to it, you know, from the grassroots up. I think the biggest one is actually the French presidential poll next month as to whether or not a sufficient number of Europeans have realised the need to exit the system. In fact, Marine Le Pen was in Moscow, I think 2 weeks ago, and met with Putin, and they had a long chat about European politics, and she talked about the need for France to exit the European Union. If France exits the European Union is dead. Finish. Whether Le Pen wins the election or not, it's very likely and possible that there could indeed be a vote forced in some of these countries. France would be a main signifier for the end of that system. The New World Order, of course, will stumble on, because it always will. It's based on, I said, a few things in America, the oil giants that are linked to Saudi Arabia, the military-industrial complex, which must have continuous war, and the international banking system, which must have continuous expansion of profits, usually made through countries to loot. They've run out of countries. So will the system have longevity? I would hope that it doesn't. And when we say no more New World Order wars, I think it might be a case of actually saying that we're witnessing the end, perhaps within the decade, of the thing called the New World Order. Let's hope so. Thank you.